I'm Peter Holt with the City of Redmond, as mentioned. I'm a senior planner and the watershed planner for the City of Redmond. I'm joined today by Josh Van Lee, who's a project manager with Osborne Engineering, and Matt Ray, who's a strategic partnerships manager with a company called Opti. Today, we're talking about a pilot project that we put together at the City of Redmond. Let's see if I can get this thing to advance. Why am I not advancing? There we go. There we go. Using a type of technology called Continuous Monitoring and Active Control, or CMAC technology. We want to explain why we were using this technology, give you a brief introduction about what this technology is, some of the modeling analysis that we use to make sure that we use this technology, this new BMP, in the right place, some considerations about optimization and implementation of this policy, of this BMP, and then some next steps with regard to our pilot project. So first of all, City of Redmond has a watershed management plan we've had since 2013. It divides the city into about 13 different watersheds. And very simply, the goal of the watershed management plan is to create environmental lift in the by working in the entire drainages that drain into streams. One of our watersheds in the upper northeast corner of Redmond, it's called Monticello Watershed. It's about 345 acres. Part of it is in King County, part of it is in Redmond, most of it in Redmond. It's considered a priority watershed, meaning that it is a watershed that, although it has stormwater impacts and some significant stormwater impacts, it also has a great opportunity for environmental lift if we take some action there. So to understand why we are taking on this pilot project in this area, we first want to talk to you a little bit about the characteristics of the watershed and some of the circumstances that are driving our decision making. One of the things that you'll notice looking at this map is that there's a lot of green areas. Those green areas are natural areas, native growth protection easements, stream buffers, wetlands. And so we don't want to build in those areas. But in addition to that, what we're also, you'll also notice there's a lot of gray in there. And if you look at the picture that's on this map, you'll see some development, and what the development looks like in this watershed. It's pretty typical development we have throughout the region. And but you'll also notice that, just looking at the map, that we're nearing build-out conditions. But the other thing I would say about this watershed is that this development occurred in different stages at different times. So scattered throughout the watershed, we have different detention facilities, vaults and ponds that were built to different standards, some to the Santa Barbara urban hydrological units, others to older DOT standards, and those offer different degrees of control and protection to Monticello Creek, the creek that we're really looking at to create the environmental lift. The big issue in this watershed, and it's the issue that faces many watersheds like it in our region, is altered hydrology. And that means two things. We have flashy flows, too much water during the winter, too much water entering the stream all at once, creating high energy flows and high pulse counts. And then because all that water is going through the system and pulsing through the systems during the winter, we also have a reduced base flows during the summer. So, the real question for increasing environmental lift in this watershed is, how do we deal with the hydrology? And so we know we need to do a couple things. One, we want to try to reduce runoff. And then we also know that we want to extend detention in the watershed. But there's a couple limitation factors that you have to consider when we're trying to do these things. One of the things is that, like many hillside watersheds throughout this region, that this is influenced by till soils. We have till soils that don't want to infiltrate water readily. And so that really limits some of the things we can do there. Another thing that we have going on in this is that because we are in a kind of a near build out condition, there's not a lot of space to work in. So if you want to try to rebuild a pond or extend a pond, you might have some, you can run into space issues. But not only can you run into space issues, you can run into the fact that you're working in an existing neighborhood. And we have to think about the disturbances that you might have to the neighborhood. And in Redmond, we don't think that going in and tearing apart people's neighborhoods to rebuild a detention pond is going to garner us a lot of support for our stormwater management efforts or for our efforts to rehabilitate streams. So we want to take that into consideration. And then there's the third factor. Redmond is a very wealthy community, and land values in Redmond are expensive. And so purchasing extra land to build facilities is expensive, and it's something we have to consider. So we know what we want to do, and we have limitations, and then we started looking for a solution to how to address some of these situations. And what we are trying is a pilot project. We're trying the CMAC, this Continuous Monitoring Active Control pilot project at 2 ponds using the Opti system. And the goal is to reduce high pulse counts and erosive flows that will cause problems in the stream. And you're probably asking, what is this adaptive or active control? And Matt is going to now explain what it is.
Thanks, Peter. So I think a little background is necessary too from my perspective. I'm a water resources engineer, similar to Josh, and I worked in a consulting world for the better part of 10 years. And about 12 years ago, we worked on a project at my consulting firm to control tidally influenced wetlands, and using Internet of Things connected sensors and kind of local logic on a computer, we were able to kind of control the flows in and out of that wetland. And so the idea of Opti was born, saying, if we can do this here, why can't we use Internet of Things and technology and software and weather forecasting to solve watershed-based problems? And so this is where Opti sits. We're 12 years, spun out as an independent company about 7.5 years ago, and software development in a product company that lives in the Microsoft Azure cloud. And we ingest all types of data sources from within a distributed watershed with sensors and water quality monitoring, control, level sensors and control of facilities. And we integrate these with other types of data like precipitation forecasts, weather forecasts, stream flows. And we use all of this information in our software platform to make control decisions that are best for that particular watershed. Peter, go to the next slide. So this is how it works on the kind of the site-by-site scale. So we take one of these detention ponds or retention ponds, like Peter showed, and they're typically designed with a passive outfall structure, which is a concrete riser or some other type of structure that has an orifice, 1 or 2 orifices, and they were historically sized for just flood control, or they may have some minimal water quality benefit. And essentially what flows into that basin would flow out during most 95% of storm events. And then every once in a while you get a big event and the facility would fill up and use that volume that it was designed for. So what our software allows us to do is to look into the future at what is predicted to come into that facility through National Weather Service forecasts and other type of third-party local forecasting. Run it through hydraulic models around that particular facility and its drainage area, and say how much water is going to come into this facility, how much storage do we have in this facility currently, and do we need to release water now, or can we release it in the future, and at what rate do we need to release it to build up the capacity that we need to prevent overflow and to protect downstream resources. We're constantly looking at these water levels in the facility, and we modify those outfall structures with a continuously actuated valve in this case. In some other cases, we can use pump systems or slide gates, depending on kind of what the existing configuration is. But what this allows us to do then is to adaptively use that flood storage and that big volumes of those facilities in almost every single event that we need to, and prevent discharge during most wet weather flows. Go ahead to the next slide, Peter. This is kind of the logic that we kind of go through during a storm event and when we're operating a facility. You have your dry weather condition, which is, if it's a dry pond, that would have no permanent pool volume. But if you have a wet pond, you have a permanent pool volume. And during that forecast period, if the weather forecast, the modeling says that we're going to get more volume in the facility than it can currently hold, we'll start to draw that facility down. We'll open a valve and we'll pre-event release. And that's essentially building new capacity within a watershed that without actually building anything, because that's dead storage. But assuming, this is a dry pond, during wet weather, we are closing those valves, allowing the facility to fill up at its whatever the typical 2 to 4 year, 6 year event that it is, holding that water for a specific period of time and then drawing it down after water quality enhancements or 48 hours or 72 hours or whatever regulations kind of dictate for the maximum holding time for those facilities. And in this particular case, so Opti's controls are used for all different types of scenarios. This is more of a water quality scenario with an enhanced retention. But what we're talking about is the flow duration logic and the flow duration control, which sets the system to discharge at the minimal rate at all times that it can potentially do with what's coming into the system. So go to the next slide, Peter. And how we do that is by enabling a drain while rain function, which allows the pond to drain during these rainfall events, not just having a valve closed, by continuously looking at these different bins of forecast information over, these forecasts are ingested every 15 minutes, they're updated, and the algorithms run every 5 minutes based on what's in the facility, what's going to come into the facility. And then there's a decision sent to the valve as to what state it should be at and what flow rate to release at. And the target is to release at the lowest potential rate so that you never violate an overflow condition, plus a factor of safety, obviously. And so we minimally discharge. We utilize that adaptive volume and that full volume of that pond so that we can essentially trickle discharge or release at much lower flow rates during the entirety of the event. And what we have found through our installations in Oregon and on the other West Coast installations is that we're reducing those pulse counts that cause these erosive flows and the flashiness indices coming out of these streams. Pulse counts and peak flows down by 75% from the current condition, not from the undeveloped condition, not from the unmitigated condition. And then 50% reductions in kind of those flashiness, bugs and bunnies kind of metrics that we study for stream health. And so I'm sure there will be a lot of questions on that, and we can get to those towards the end here. But I want to turn it over to Josh here to talk about kind of the model that we built and how we determined where to put these projects.
Sounds good. Thanks, Matt. So we started with 4 sites that we analyzed to determine which ones we wanted to move forward with. The 4 sites were in the Monticello Basin, Curry, Whistler Ridge, Fisher Village, Tellura A. You can see them on the map here. They drain towards the east of Monticello Creek. The criteria that we were looking at for site selection were that we wanted to look at ponds built under previous standards. That's where we expected to get the most benefit. We wanted to model the level of improvement and see what our anticipated improvement was to flow durations. We wanted to look at the cost and see if there were variations in the cost, neighborhood impacts, and then access and security, just kind of looking at the location of the ponds and how secure they are. Next slide. So for our modeling approach, we started with Western Washington guidelines. So using the Western Washington hydrology model, looking at flow durations. We focused on flow durations here because we were expecting that if we improved flow durations, we would also get an improvement in the things like the flashiness and the pulse counts that are directly related to the BIBI. So the WWHM model output was then fed into a CMAC spreadsheet that has been developed by Opti. And just kind of a note on Opti's technology, it's approved by the Department of Ecology. It has TAPE approval and is functionally equivalent to any type of standard outfall structure. So it can be used on any kind of pond, wet pond or detention pond or any other type of pond that would use a standard outfall to control the volume of water in the pond. So within the CMAC spreadsheet, we set some targets for our modeling. Maximum water surface elevation was the first one. So with that one, we wanted to allow the ponds to fill up as much as possible to utilize the full volume And then allowable release rate was targeting a release rate that would be below the erosive flows. So, below the flow range that is regulated by ecology for flow durations. Next slide. So I'll share a couple examples. This is the first one where we saw some positive results at the Whistler Ridge Pond. This is a graph of our flow durations. So you've got the flow rates versus the duration exceeding. So that's over the long-term simulation in WWHM. The blue line on here is pre-developed conditions. So that represents the forested conditions that would have been there before any development occurred in this basin. Developed unmitigated is if you just had the development basically draining directly into the creek with no detention, no mitigation there. Existing conditions is with the existing detention pond and outlet structure. As you can see, there's an improvement there from the developed unmitigated. It brings it closer, but it's still not meeting pre-developed conditions. And then the CMAC mitigated was our model scenario with the Opti controls, the active controls. So you can see at the lower flows, we were able to show that we expected the flows to meet the duration requirements. At the higher flows, we were still limited by the pond volume. And a note on meeting the pre-developed durations, because it's a retrofit project, our target is to get as close as possible to pre-developed, but because it's not a new development, we don't need to fully meet the pre-developed conditions for all of the flow. So we're really targeting the maximum improvement that we can get. Next slide. So second example, this is one where we saw kind of some mixed results. This was the Fisher Village Pond. Same color scheme here, but what we saw with this one was that at the higher flow rates, the existing pond actually did not do too bad. So the volume is probably okay in the existing pond. At the lower flows, we were exceeding the duration. So this is telling me that the orifice may be undersized and releasing too much water at those low flows. So we felt like we could probably get some improvements at this pond if we did a CMAC retrofit, but we didn't, for our selection, we wanted to pick the two best ponds out of the four we were looking at. So, we saw better improvement at two other ponds, so we decided not to move forward with this one at this time. Next slide. So some takeaways from our site selection and modeling process. Going back to costs, the costs were fairly similar for each of these locations that we looked at. It was around $150,000, $155,000 per pond. And that's just due to the hardware and the Opti components being relatively similar across the board for each of the sites that we looked at. But when you compare the installation costs for this Opti retrofit with building or expanding the pond, you would expect a lot lower price. So this 150,000 range is going to be quite a bit lower than purchasing adjacent properties that you would probably have to do if you wanted to expand the footprint of the pond. So because of that, it was very cost effective compared to other options that were on the table. We felt like the modeling was critical for determining the benefits. Just taking a high level view of the plans and drainage reports, we didn't necessarily have a good idea of which ones would show the best improvement. So the modeling really helped us to dial that in and make good selections. And then the neighborhood factor is just kind of the idea that these can be installed pretty quickly over a week or a couple weeks with minimal impact to the neighborhood. These were on city-owned parcels, so there was no work in the roadway, there was no traffic control required, no impact to neighbors. So definitely good from the standpoint of not causing a long construction project that's going to impact the neighborhood. Yeah, go ahead. I'll pass it back to Matt.
All right, thanks, Josh. And just a few additional slides kind of about how these actually get installed. Like Josh said, our typical installs are like 3 to 5 days. It includes see a contractor here in the center installing a flange for the mounting of the actuated valve. It's a third-party off-the-shelf Rotork industrial grade valve. We usually block off the low flow orifices during this part of the design. And in the left here, you'll see the actuator sticking out of the manhole with the solar powered control panel, which has all the communications hardware, is wired to the actuator, to the level sensors, has the cellular communications and a 10-day battery system, because everything is solar powered. Even the actuator and all the sensors, everything is powered via solar. So the next slide, Peter. And then the way we set these projects up is we utilize kind of design resources and hydrology models to set the initial kind of configuration of how the Opti control system will operate that pond and what those inputs are for the runoff into the facility. And what we do over the first 3-month period, or 5 to 6 events, is we look at what actually happens. And our engineering team actively watches each rainfall event and looks at the rainfall runoff response into that facility versus real rainfall. And we come up with customized configuration parameters for how these systems should operate going forward. And so we send those back to the city and say, hey, here's what we've viewed. This is how the system would have run if we would have used these from the beginning, to look at the kind of the operational performance. And then we go ahead and we set that to automatic control, where we do weekly checks on the system to make sure everything is running appropriately, and then annual checks on the performance of those configuration parameters to see if they need to be updated. Next slide, Peter. And then this is what it looks like from the user's perspective. And this may get to some of the points of the second question that came in. This is kind of the administrator's view of the system. You typically get an overview of all of your facilities on kind of a global map, and you can drill down into each individual pond. And here in the top left corner is the system control, where you can take manual control of the facility if you want to open a valve and drain a pond or turn a pump on or whatever you're controlling. We typically only want the decision makers on these to have this access. You can have view only modes for any number of users. And in this dashboard, you'll see all of your system parameters, right? You'll see the water level that's in your pond. You'll see the valve state, the target valve state, what the volume forecast it is, how much, what weather prediction is. You'll see a radar on here. You can ingest rainfall data. You can also show stream gauges. There's all types of different things that you can add here. Kind of whatever sensors are in the field will be displayed here. And you can time navigate to any period of time that the installation has been in the ground and communicating, and that'll instantly show up here. And then you can also export your data at any time in any kind of time series that you would like, into CSV, Excel, or SWIM kind of modeling formats for any of the parameters that you're monitoring. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Peter to kind of wrap up, and then I'll start going through the questions.
All right, so a couple of things on next steps about this pilot project. One of the things that I'd like to do is do a more in-depth cost net benefit analysis. Hadn't had time to do that, but we found out that just looking at this and then thinking about the property values in Redmond, just squinting at it, it looks like this is a solution that, for construction-wise, would be about an order of magnitude less than what it would cost to extend a pond. So, but we want to really dive into that and do some additional analysis on this. We also want to monitor these pilot projects and see how they're working. And the nice thing about Opti is that it's continually collecting data. So we will be able to look at the outcomes at particular ponds, and then we'll be able to measure that against some of the measurements that we're having in the stream to see if we're kind of reaching the impacts that we want to get. Monitor the Watershed is part of the paired watershed study. That's it for those who are involved in the SAM project, with the NPDES SAM project. Know what that is. It's a study that's looking at different treatments in different watersheds in Redmond to determine how those treatments are working to improve conditions in streams and cause environmental lifts. So we were able to use that program to kind of judge and evaluate the effectiveness of this pilot project, which is very good. At the same time, we're also looking for some additional CMAC pilot projects that we might want to have in the basin, I think to just understand the technology better, but also to see if we do get a signal that's saying that we are seeing some changes in and some beneficial results of this technology, it would amplify that signal. Right now, the project's going to cover about 10% of the watershed. And then if we'd like to increase that to about 20%, so we'd actually be retrofitting about 20% of the watershed with some kind of hydrological retrofit using this technology. I think there's an opportunity for outreach with this technology. We do live in the land of Microsoft. This uses Microsoft technology, so we don't often have a lot of innovative and tech-driven technologies in stormwater, but this is one, and I'd like to see if that is something that could be used as a hook to engage with the people who live in and near Monticello watershed to see if they're interested in this and get them more interested in our watershed management planning and just stormwater in general. As far as permit compliance, Monticello will be our stormwater management action plan watershed, so it becomes part of that that plan to address the NPDES requirements. But I also think about this technology, I'm thinking in terms of the phase 1 structural control requirements and the need to do retrofits to get the points necessary for that. And I wonder if some of the jurisdictions that are facing that requirement might be up against the same set of circumstances that I'm facing in Monticello watershed. And then lastly, we want to share results when we start getting data and everything and come back to people and tell people how well this is working and how much it worked, and compare it to some of the initial monitoring data that we, or monitoring results that we received. So with that, we're going to take some questions, and I guess we have some in the box already.
Yeah, Peter, I'll go ahead and read the questions. I think they're probably mostly going to be directed to me. So the first question from Doug, is there any assurance that the water release has had enough time to be treated? So the dashboards and the Opti controls will, it's continuously collecting data for how long water was contained within the system. We typically do an annual report, which will show the average retention time and the increase in retention time, but the system will always operate to safely discharge and safely have storage. So there's not an override on this water has to be held for this amount of time, but it's always a lift. It's always an improvement from the passive condition, right? So if it was, it will be in a water quality increase by having an enhanced retention time. Most of the time we show like 6 to 8x on the time that each slug of water is essentially held within that facility. So you can use the data to kind of figure out what the average residence time is there, but there's no assurance. I mean, hopefully that gets to the answer to the question, because it's not like one of those things that we can change to say you have to hold everything for a certain period of time, because it was kind of violate some of the safety if there were back-to-back storms. Second question, is this a system that can be controlled and maintained by existing maintenance staff with some training? So, I mean, obviously it can be maintained. So one of the other features is that there are real-time alerts built into all of these systems. So there are about 40 some parameters that we can alert on. And so if there is a delta in the expected drawdown versus the observed drawdown, which may indicate some type of clog or embankment, some type of failure, either way of that delta, then automated kind of alerting can go to maintenance staff. Or you can set thresholds, like if the water goes over this level, let people know. If it goes below this level, let people know. So the beauty of having this real-time data and always monitored by the software is that it can enhance your maintenance practices. Go ahead, Peter.
And just one more thing too, we took this to our O&M staff, our maintenance and operations staff, and had them look at the maintenance and operation manual that came with Opti. They said, this is not that big a deal. And in fact, we have Matt coming out later this month to come out and have a socially distanced kind of operational field training about how the system works and answer questions about O&M and kind of the manual variety of the system. So from a maintenance and operations standpoint, feedback that we're getting from our crew right now has been really positive. So that's good.
And then Larry asked, what are the annual O&M costs, and are these costs relatively stable over time? So as Peter said, it's not much different from a maintenance perspective within the facility itself. The Opti hardware has a maintenance component where you need to clean sensors and just verify valves work, usually biannually. I mean, it's a few $1,000s a year for kind of the Opti equipment O&M. And then the operational cost is the software licensing. Opti is a software platform that runs these systems continuously with like a lot of data expanded. So the city of Redmond holds a software license, which goes across each individual, which can go across the entirety of the city and watershed, which is a one-time software license. So we kind of take that out of operation cost. And then the individual pond will have like a seat license, which is what, like if you have a group of organization using Adobe, everybody that uses it has to pay like a seat license. And then I can share those kind of net present value costs with anybody if they want to follow up with me after this. And they are stable over time. Yeah. The only thing is the replacement of level sensors is the variance. The actuators are industrial grade and graded for like 25 plus years of operation. But the level sensors tend to have a 3 to 4 year lifespan on them, and they're a couple $1,000s that need to be replaced once in a while. Russell asked, is there a backup power supply in case of power outage during a storm, and can the valve get stuck closed? So like I said, the solar system has a 10-day battery backup. And so there's a 10-day supply of power in case of, obviously there's not generally power outages to the solar systems, but we also have line powered systems, and those line powered systems will have a 3-day battery backup installed on them so that there will be that capability set to operate the valve when power is out or cellular or communications are out. So each of these valves has a fail-safe condition. There's local logic on the valve in case of a temporary communications or power loss where it will continue to operate. And then after a set period of time, that actuator and valve will go to whatever the fail-safe condition is, which most of the time is fail open, so that the pond operates as more of like a passive with a large outflow for flood or overflow protection. And yes, valves have the potential to get stuck closed if, like a big tree were to wedge them closed or something along those lines, or a big limb, but the system would let the maintenance staff and the operations staff know immediately, because as soon as the Opti system went to move a valve or open a valve and it did not respond, because we get feedback control, we get feedback information from the valves on what their states are. So if we tried to engage it and it did not engage, there would be a maintenance alert that would go out. So hopefully I answered those questions sufficiently. If you want, if there's any additional info on those, you can unmute and ask me, and we can kind of get into more details. Or any other questions?
So Lori, people can unmute now and go ahead and ask questions. Is that correct?
Yes.
While we're waiting if there's any other questions, Peter, we can talk a little bit about we've done some of this cost analysis associated with what it would take for a retrofit, a standard retrofit process where you would just build the basin larger. And so we looked at these two facilities and found that you would essentially have to double the footprint of the pond with the existing outfall structure to get the equivalent benefit. And as we all know, doubling the footprint of one of these large ponds would probably require buying multiple $1 million worth of real estate. And $500,000 and to $1 million.
Might require some impoundments and other things that are politically not that viable either. So it's working in tight systems that gets back that issue.
And then one other thing that Josh and I have been working on is the calculation of the flow duration control benefit and the points that were with the phase 1 permittees and the structural controls. Is, we've been calculating the volume underneath those two curves and creating the ratio per the Western Washington guidance in Appendix 12, and coming up with kind of like this points calculation. And it's looking like these two facilities are getting between 55 to 80% of the drainage area as an environmental lift, right? So in one of them, that was like 30 points. Or equivalent of 30 acres of flow duration control, and the other one I think was 12, something along those lines. So, Lauren asked, "Is this a system that could be vulnerable to cyber attack?" So Opti is built on the Azure cloud, and the Azure cloud that we're built on has Department of Defense enabled security protocols on it, because we actually do control things at like EPA headquarters. And we, obviously as a company, an IoT company, a software company, security is our number one concern, especially as we grow and get into more control of like regional type facilities. The main way that we prevent this is that all of the communications between Opti and like the field systems are all one way, right? So somebody, there's not really, it's all encrypted, kind of distributed kind of thing. The only true risk is if somebody were to hack passwords or sign-ons of an employee of Redmond and go and open a valve. But the actual risk associated with that in these situations is almost none. I mean, it's just like someone would be opening a valve and maybe releasing a little bit more water at some point. So it's not, it's not a very high risk. You can't say that risk doesn't exist of cyber attack, which it does in any type of internet-based system or cloud-based system, but it's extraordinarily low, and the risk of even if it happened is extraordinarily low. Do you ever need to change the location of the outlet? That is not something we have often needed to replace an outfall structure where we'll have an old corrugated metal pipe structure or something that's just not sufficient for a valve, or we have had to add one where there's just a discharge pipe in the bottom of a basin, and we'll add like a weir wall or something with a control strut with a valve in it. But we've never actually relocated an outlet or put in like a new pipe through an embankment or anything along those lines. I think we kind of start to lose a little bit of our cost benefit when we get into that level of construction. Has Opti been used for other types of facilities? Vaults. Is Redmond planning on using Opti on other types of facilities or just ponds? Opti is actually used on almost any type of impoundment. So we have stormwater infiltration vaults, we have rainwater harvesting vaults, we have ponds, we have lakes that we manage, and like regional like flood facilities. So it's pretty much any type of impoundment that you can control with an outfall is retrofittable or controllable by Opti's software. It's kind of ubiquitous to whatever you want to control. And then I'll let Peter ask about the other plans for.
So yeah, and we are looking at using Opti at some vaults at some regional facilities, and then also Josh is right now doing a feasibility study and looking at Opti at a vault in Monticello. And I think he said it would look very favorable at the vault in Monticello. Is that correct?
Yeah, it did. And it was kind of, I think the way that the vault is with the vertical walls and just having a large controllable volume. I think the question on the outlet structure is interesting when you look at a vault. The one we were looking at would potentially need like a new manhole outside of the vault in order to have an emergency overflow. So that's probably a consideration, but that's going to be on more of a case-by-case basis.
One other question, Peter. Thanks. Is Redmond only looking at city-owned facilities?
That is a conversation that we need to have. It's an interesting conversation, and we have not answered it yet. So that's my answer to that. Matt did talk about some ways that we know that we think that there are some opportunities for public-private partnerships. We also think might be some opportunities where we create a system where private ponds are managed by the city through some memorandum of understanding, but we have not delved in that conversation. And so that came up yesterday at a presentation that we were giving within our city, and it's something that we're going to have to figure out how to use. And it's one of those things that you have to deal with when you start using a new technology and trying to figure out. I think so that's kind of where we're at with it right now.
Yeah, historically we have. So on the East Coast, we have a client that has Opti controls is actually required in the regulatory code for any type of new connection to their system. And the way that they have done that is to hold the master software license with Opti and then charging the developers kind of the annual fee all at once, capitalized, for operating that facility as kind of a connection fee and a active control fee. So that's one way that we've kind of engaged the private and the development community. And then the other way is that Opti and the Nature Conservancy actually have a joint venture where we have option agreements signed as a development vehicle, and we have option agreements signed with a bunch of landowners like your Walmarts and other kind of big landholders that own a lot of these stormwater ponds, to do Opti retrofits on those projects and for the benefit of the public. And for kind of sale of those outcomes to cities and municipalities. And we've completed some of those on the East Coast and in the Chesapeake Bay, where they kind of have those types of markets on private ponds and for the use of like the Maryland Department of Transportation. So those are two kind of examples as how we have integrated the private entities into the kind of the public good. Another question from Russell said, on the charts you had presented that the lower flow rates were lower than historic outfalls, and so could the controls be adjusted to allow higher release rate up to the regulatory allowed release rate? I think I can leave that one for Josh, but the short answer is that it was so much less of a benefit than the others from the beginning that we didn't really iterate in the model. It just kind of that was just kind of an exclusion criteria to just move forward with the others.
Yeah, and I think if it's a question of like whether we're overperforming kind of, so like if we're releasing a lot less than what would be regulatory required, I think that could be adjusted during the optimization phase or at a future phase. So, we did our options analysis to identify the best benefits, but then we're working with Opti now to go through and optimize each pond. So they could definitely adjust that low release rate. If it's too low, they could bump it up a little bit, or if it's not performing like we expect, they could bump it down.
Yeah, well, it just won't. I think the question is, it wouldn't add enough of a benefit on those higher flow rates, because that is really a constraint on pond size versus the drainage area. So that's not something that by releasing a little higher rates earlier we could really get to, because that's not really kind of the confounding factor there. Doug asked if there's any issues with vandalism. We have had a few. So Opti has 160 plus installs over 20 states in the US, and as I know it, we've probably had 3 to 4 sites that have had someone like steal a control or steal like the wiring or get to a control or a solar panel. So that's why Josh and Peter talked about location, making a lot of times these ponds are kind of set back or they're fenced, and and sometimes we actually have protected certain things. A lot of our control stuff is locked and IP rated for outdoor kind of use. It is for outdoor use case, so that the internals can be protected. But yeah, in kind of the world we all live in now, vandalism is a concern. So it is something you have to think about when we site and locate these systems.
So for our pilot project, we purposely picked ponds that would have gates on them. Doesn't mean that people can't get in there, but we picked, just as a deterrent for that first run, and then over time we'll have to see what we want to do if we want to extend this program. But for the pilot project, at least, that was one of our considerations. And not only were they performing well, but they also had gates, and we could lock them up.
So Keith is asking the question that I get probably more than any other question, which is how does the accuracy of the weather forecast affect the actual performance of the system? And so that is a very, it's kind of a regional question, right? In Washington, in particular, in Western Washington and Oregon, well, with the rainfall distribution that we have being a lot more predictable and a lot less flashy and a lot less intense, the weather forecast, the systems often perform very well comparative to forecasting in certain areas like Texas or other flashy flows, because you have real-time feedback loops as well, which is what is actually coming into the system, affects kind of the discharge calculations just as much as the weather forecasting does for kind of making future decisions. What we have found, and we've done a lot of weather modeling and a lot of looking at how a system performed versus the forecast versus the actual, is that the majority of events that would cause any type of issue with an overflow or a kind of a system error where you would be concerned that the accuracy of the forecast was off, those large events tend to have very high predictability in the short term, because we're looking at each one of those forecasts in every 15 minutes a new forecast comes in. And so we can, we size our discharge and our drawdown rates to be able to rapidly respond to those types of situations in those types of weather systems, so that we can, get water out quickly when we need to. So, overall, we haven't had any real issues around forecast inaccuracy. We use both the National Weather Service and we use a service called Dark Sky. And then there's also other types of proprietary weather systems like Climacell and others that use kind of local on the ground distributed points to get a hyper local forecast. So weather forecasting has kind of come a long way, and it's not just a look once and that's how we make our decisions for the rest of the day. It's like, look at this forecast every 15 minutes and look at what's happening and keep making those decisions. So that feedback loop actually kind of helps to mitigate some of the inaccuracies. And then we also set weather forecasting. We set like performance metrics on how accurate do you want this system to be, right? Do you only want to make a decision if it's a 90% event, or do you want to be very proactive? And if it's a 50% forecast event over a certain volume, you can pick volumes, you can pick forecast probabilities, and that's all dictated by our client and how they want the system to perform from kind of a safety, like, do we want to be over anxious and draw this thing down quickly because there's a flood issue here, or do we want to make sure that the rain is really coming before we release anything, because there's no real, there's no real issue around some overflow. So that's all kind of customized during the design stage. Peter, how are we looking on time? 12:53. Question, have you looked at a combination of Opti and an increase in basin size to meet flow control standards? So if you did an increased basin, it may be twice the size, but with Opti, it could be a much smaller factor. That is 100% a possibility. You would be able to meet pre-development hydrology with a much smaller capital footprint of increase, if that was a requirement, right? If you had to meet the pre-development hydrology. But I think the driving factor is that this is a simple 1 week construction retrofit where you get a pretty big delta of improvement without actually needing to reach pre-development hydrology. So you can do more distributed at a larger scale. But yes, you're correct. You could decrease the amount you would actually have to enhance the basin if you wanted to actually get it to match that curve.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And we're doing some of that, looking at the Redmond vaults with Curtis. I see Curtis is on here too. But that's definitely the question that we're asking there is, can we decrease the size of a future vault using the active controls?
Well, I think we may have wrapped it up there just in time.
Good. I think we exhausted the questions.
Yep. Thanks
Okay.
for their attention and great questions.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Lori, for setting this up for us. We appreciate
You're
that.
welcome. And this has been recorded, so I will be